From stories of wendigos, werewolves, and much more, tonight we have 8 stories detailing 8 different cryptid sightings. We are joined by my good friends Bad Vibes Storytelling and Vidith22, so if you enjoy their narrations, be sure to check them out in the description. A huge thank you to all of tonight's writers. Remember to send in your own story if you'd like to have it featured. You can either submit it at my subreddit r/slumberreads, or my email you can find in the description. Be sure to drop a like if you enjoy. Subscribing if you're new is also very much appreciated. We are getting very close to 70k. Enjoy the video, and as always, I hope you all have a great night. We all have that one friend who takes things too far. For me, that friend was Matt. I've known him since high school. We were both outcasts, not into sports, and didn't care what the big name athletes, actors, or musicians were doing. Our shared fascination was the paranormal, ghosts, monsters, urban legends, and mysterious things. Growing up in Charlotte, Louisiana, the region was ripe with such stories, and marshland to inflame our teenage imagination. Of all these legends, the one that had the greatest hold on Matt's imagination was the story of a hidden lake, where an ancient creature dwells and was offered sacrifices a century ago. Along with a few like-minded outcasts, we would spend hours researching local legends. While our classmates spent their nights drinking and partying, we spent them in the woods and every abandoned place we could get into searching for proof. Sometimes we would see an odd shadow or heard a strange noise and convince ourselves it was the goat man, wandering spirit, or whatever we were hunting that night. In all our wanderings, we never found the barest hint of the hidden lake. I think that's what drove Matt. He would study any map he thought old enough to show it, and I've lost count of the number of times he dragged us to some remote spot, claiming to have found it. By senior year, our expeditions had become less frequent. The last one I remember was spending a night in what we thought was an abandoned asylum, that I'm pretty sure was just an office building. We still loved horror stories, urban legends, and the like. We would get together to share stories and watch any low-budget movie we could get our hands on. The drop in expeditions did not sit well with Matt. He wanted to keep searching. There were a couple of times I agreed to go with him when no one else would. The final blow came at the end of April. We had been gearing up for a night of horror stories and movies when Matt demanded we go to some new location he found. The weather that night was horrible, and no one sane would want to leave the comfort of a warm home. Matt said the weather conditions and date made it perfect. No one wanted to go. Matt got angry, and when I refused to go, he stormed out in a rage. I lost touch with Matt after graduation. I tried to keep tabs on him through Facebook, which he barely updated, and the occasional text which he never answered. College life was good. My relationship with Anna was growing more serious, and I helped some classmates develop an indie horror-based game on my old wanderings. The future was looking good. Near the end of my 2-year program, I heard from Matt. It was a short and simple text. I found it. Meet me here Sunday. And he provided a location I will not repeat. I didn't respond right away. I hadn't heard from him in almost 2 years, and suddenly he wants to meet? I did a quick Google search on the location. It wasn't too far, but still an isolated area. I showed Anna the text. She convinced me to go. Matt had been our friend, and maybe I'd get some material to work on another game. Besides, maybe after this, Matt would finally get over his obsession and move on. On Sunday, I arrived at the location Matt gave me a few minutes after the designated time. There was an old beat-up car sitting on the roadside. As I pulled up next to it, the driver got out. "Finally," Matt said as I got out of my car. "Good to see you too," I responded. I was going to say something else, but Matt's appearance made me stop. He looked emaciated, like he'd forgotten to eat for several days. His eyes were sunken, a look I had seen on classmates after all-night study sessions. His hair was long and disheveled. There were patches of beard on his face, as if he shaved quickly and messily. "Matt?" I finally said. "What happened to you?" "I told you, I found it," he responded. "In some old police reports." "No," I said. "I mean, You look like a mess. When's the last time you ate? Or even had a decent night's sleep? You sound like my parents, Matt responded scornfully. They never understood my goals. They just kept pushing me to go to college or find a job. They never understood. He led me into the woods. Bugs buzzed around my head. The sounds of animals scurrying in the brush and birds overhead. For a moment, it felt like old times. Walking through the woods again in search of things that don't exist. Matt remained silent as we walked. I was hoping he would say something. Anything about where we were going. Finally, I had to say something. Are you going to tell me why you're still after this lake? I asked. After all the ghosts, monsters, and assorted other things we chased, why is this lake still so damn important? Because all of that other stuff is BS, he said flatly. Small-minded humans trying to understand something they can't. What makes you so sure? I asked. Matt stopped and glared at me. I'll explain once we get there. We walked deeper into the woods silently. I don't know how long we walked, and I was regretting my decision to come. The vegetation looked wrong. The plants were sickly, with a grayish tint. It was then I realized how quiet the woods had become. I'm no biologist, but I know nature is not silent. There should be bugs, birds, and animals scurrying. The forest should be alive with noise, but there was only silence. The only time nature was this silent was during a snowstorm or some dangerous predator nearby. The trees grew closer together. The grayish tint on the leaves was worse. Parts of the trunks were rotten. Finally, we stepped through the trees and there was the lake Matt had spent years seeking. Right away, I knew this was a bad place. The water was foamy and gray. The ground around the lake was barren with not even a single blade of grass. Next to the lake was a large smooth slat stone. Steeping a little closer, I could see old reddish stains. See? Matt said excitedly. I told you it was real. Yeah, great. I said, both impressed that Matt had found it, and repulsed by the atmosphere of the place. Can we go now? Not yet, said Matt, and he took a tape recorder out of his pocket. He placed the device on the ground and pressed play. The sound of drums began to play. What the hell? I started to ask. Before I could finish, Matt began to chant. I have no idea what he said. I couldn't recognize the language and wouldn't even know where to begin to write it down. As Matt chanted, I heard the sound of wings above us, and large bats were flying overhead. The water of the lake had begun to bubble and foam. Matt? I shouted. What the hell are you doing? Matt stopped chanting. It called to me, he explained. In my dreams, it reached out to me, told me how to find this place. All those rumors and weird things that happened in this area, that was it, trying to lure people here. Matt reached for a hunting knife on his belt that I hadn't noticed before. It was worshipped as the link between the gods and men, but then the police raided the place and ruined things, he explained. The surface of the lake looked like a pot of boiling water. The surface was bubbling and frothing madly. A foul stench began to come from the lake, the smell of rot and decay. Matt walked towards me, his knife at the ready. It wants the old ways back. It wants a cult again. It wants sacrifices, all those sightings of ghosts, demons, and whatever. It was trying to draw people back here. Matt lunged at me with the knife. I stepped back to avoid a strike. What the hell is wrong with you? I demanded. I'm sorry, Matt said. I need a sacrifice. It has to be this way. Matt swung the knife again. Instinctively, I raised my arm to defend myself. I prevented it from hitting my neck, but it cut deep into my left arm. I staggered back toward the flat stone. Matt lunged forward again. I sidestepped his attack, then grabbed him. I used Matt's momentum to swing him around and threw him into the large stone. He tripped over it and tumbled towards the shore. Matt stood up, but my attention was captured by something past him in the lake. Something had broken the surface. A large, white form was rising up from the water. I don't think any words I have can properly describe this horror. The closest I can get is a mound of melted white trash bags. The stench was now almost overwhelming. Several spots on this mass were luminous in the shadowy glen. I had the crazy notion that those were its eyes. Matt had gotten to his feet again and was stepping over the flat stone. In a moment, equal parts desperation and inspiration, I grabbed a baseball-sized rock from the ground and hurled it at Matt. Luck or something else was on my side. The stone hit him in the head and sent him back to the ground, a small trickle of blood coming from his hairline. I was looking for another weapon when Matt screamed. I looked up to see the thing in the lake had wrapped some kind of tentacle or appendage around Matt's leg and was pulling him towards it. "Help!" Matt screamed. He sliced the tentacles with his knife. When that failed, he clawed at the ground desperately, trying to keep away from this thing. I stood transfixed as Matt fought for his survival. "Help, please!" Matt shouted again. Just moments before he had tried to kill me, but he was still my friend. I ran forward and grabbed Matt's hand. I braced myself against the flat stone and tried to pull him free. The thing in the lake was strong. It did not want to give up such a meal after so many years. I pulled as hard as I could. We might have been in that stalemate for hours until one of us tired. However, my hand was wet with blood from the knife wound. I tried to hold on, but it was not possible. I felt Matt's hand slide from the blood-slicked hand and towards the thing. I watched transfixed in horror as he was pulled into the shapeless mass, screaming fear and pain. I could see his flesh being eaten away by the creature's mass. It was dissolving him alive. If I had a gun, I would have shot Matt to save him the pain. His screams got louder as he was now up to his waist. Matt's screams finally stopped when his chest was halfway submerged. His face was frozen with pain and fear. With his screams silenced, I could hear a faint sucking sound of the thing absorbing what had been my friend. Once Matt was gone, the thing's tentacles appeared again, this time edging its way towards me. I turned and ran from that hellish lake. I don't know how I found my car again, and have no memory of getting back to my dorm. The next thing I remember was waking up in the hospital, with Anna and a man sitting next to me. My roommate had found me passed out on the floor bleeding and called 911. Anna was called after that. She was at my side once her class was over. The man was Detective Philip Lagrasse, a man who came from a long line of law enforcement. Once he was permitted by the doctor overseeing my care, he questioned me about where Matt was. Anna told him about the text and that I was going to meet him. Matt's parents were found dead, their throats cut while they slept. From the look of the bodies, they had been dead at least a week. They had found some of Matt's clothes with his parents' blood on them. The money his father kept in the house was gone. They suspected Matt had become angry with his parents and killed them, stealing the money to start a new life somewhere else. I told Detective Lagrasse about Matt's obsession with the unknown lake, and that he had dragged me into the woods to find it. I couldn't let anyone else find that lake, so I told the detective that once we were deep in the woods, Matt had pulled a knife and attacked me, cutting my arm. We struggled and I knocked him down and struck his head on a rock. Once he was down, I ran. I gave the detective the location of Matt's car. Once they inspected the car, they found the missing money and what they considered to be proof of his plan to disappear. Detective Lagrasse confided in me the police feel Matt is dead. Their theory is Matt suffered a concussion when his head hit the rock and, in a delusional state, he wandered deeper into the woods rather than towards his car and had succumbed to the elements or a predator more than capable of taking down an injured human. Detective Lagrasse assured me no charges would be brought against me, as all evidence pointed to Matt being emotionally unstable and very capable of murder. In their eyes, it was a clear case of self-defense. I'd like to believe it was the thing's influence that changed Matt and drove him to those horrible acts. I hope that he is in a better place, since seeing that white polypus thing, I have been suffering a nightmare. I find myself in a great city made of Titan stone. The proportions of the place are all wrong. I hear a deep voice chanting the same thing Matt did on that day. The words haunt my mind and I still cannot tell what language it is. I will not even try to phonetically write down what is being said. I feel a pull at my mind, something whispering to me, offers of power and freedom from the monotonous life. Was this what infected Matt? Anna and I are going to be leaving Louisiana soon. She's been accepted to a school in New York. I've applied to the same school. I can only pray that New York is beyond this thing's reach. About 20-ish years ago, I used to travel a lot for work. I'll spare you the details regarding my job. The 5 years I spent there are mostly a blur of meetings, car trips, and too many fast food meals, but there is one story that I remember. I had just finished a business meeting in a city roughly 3 hours from my home. My boss had offered to get me a hotel room, but because it was a Friday night and only 7:30, I decided to just drive home. Because it would save money, he agreed. I was on my second ginger ale and third Green Day song when I saw something, I should say, someone, standing next to the road. I could make out the details as I got closer. Whoever they were dressed in a really messy manner. Mud-stained jeans, wrinkled faded shirt, shaggy dark hair, and, oddly enough, a green scarf. There was a beat-up suitcase at his feet, and his thumb was out in the traditional hitchhiking bend. My first instinct was to keep driving, but for some reason, I pulled over. I still don't know why. He didn't hesitate. He opened the passenger side door. The kids had broken the door lock and hopped in. "Thank you so much, stranger," he said in a friendly southern accent. If I had to describe it, it was like a sing-song Georgian accent. Despite the state his clothes were in, his face and hair were surprisingly clean. He didn't show any of the physical signs of drugs or drinking, and there was no bulge that would indicate a gun under his shirt. I was far from comfortable with this, but decided to give him a ride. "Where are you heading?" "Trying to get north, friend. If you could just take me to the nearest bus station, I'd be much obliged." "Man, I'm glad I ran into a nice guy like you and not some killer or something. See, I'm not really used to doing this type of thing. I usually take buses, but I got stuck and missed my bus home. How dumb is that, friend?" I had started driving again. We ended up talking for 30 minutes straight. I offered him a soda from the 6-pack I'd brought with me, and he guzzled it in a minute. By then, all of my worries about him being a psycho killer were practically gone. Maybe that's why I had such a serious lapse in judgment and picked up the second hitchhiker. This time, he was on the side of the road, jumping in the air and waving his arms. Closer inspection showed that his eyes were wide as humanly possible, and he was screaming something. I rolled the window down a crack. "Help! Please, help!" I didn't think twice. I just stopped. He jumped right in. I was about to ask my passenger to move when I noticed that he had somehow already gotten into the back seat. I did a double take. How on earth had he managed that without me seeing him? He just put a finger over his lips. Quiet. I got a more detailed look at my second passenger. I knew almost instantly that I had made a mistake. His eyes weren't wide from fear. The redness in them made that clear. On top of that, he reeked of alcohol, and there was a look in his eyes. I started driving, and just tried to focus on the road ahead. My second passenger had boarded at the last town for nearly 100 miles. We were now on that stretch of the highway that goes on for miles without so much as a billboard. To make matters worse, we were in the middle of the desert. Trouble started about 15 minutes into the drive. I heard the click of something metallic. I knew what it was before he held it to my forehead. "Pull over." What else could I do? I put on my four-ways and got over. "You never asked me for my name, not even where I was going. That's pretty rude, dude." "Where are you going?" "Little late to ask now, isn't it?" His words were somewhat slurred, and his eyes were still wide. Was he high? I stole a look at the pistol in my rearview mirror. I noticed two things. The pistol wasn't loaded, so he was either high or the worst killer ever. And my first passenger was starting to look different. Was he bigger? "I asked you a question, dude." He dug the gun's barrel a little further into my temple. "Any last words?" "Your gun's not loaded." "Those are your last..." "Wait, what? You're lying." He took the gun away from my head, though it was still pointed in my direction. I took this opportunity to check on my poor first passenger. He'd been silent the whole time. He must have been absolutely terrified. I froze. He was shaking violently, but not in terror. He was staring at the gun-wielding would-be carjacker. He started opening and closing his mouth, like a fish desperate for water. He started to grow and grow. He already took up the back seat. He looked like an inflated ball. He finally stopped growing. His arm, now as thick and strong as a 2x4, shot out and grabbed the gun out of the criminal's hands. His head shot up, eyes still wide. The creature's other arm snatched the front of his shirt, lifting him effortlessly into the air. He screamed. The creature, still with that friendly southern drawl, lifted the gun and spoke. "Don't you know how dangerous guns are, friend? Perhaps I ought to show you." He pinned him against the dashboard and held him there with his knee. He used 2 enormous fingers to pry the man's mouth open, revealing a row of missing and decayed teeth. The creature took the gun, noticed that it was empty, and searched the owner's pockets. He found 2 spares and loaded the pistol. He shoved the gun into his victim's mouth, causing him to gag. I knew it was going to happen. My stomach dropped and my courage failed. I looked away, trying to cover my ears. I still heard the gunshot, all too clearly. It took me hours to get the bloodstains out of my car the next day. I stared in horror at the creature as it deflated. In 15 or 30 seconds, he was normal again. Normal, of course, being a relative term. Thanks again for the ride, friend, and I can't apologize enough for the mess. I'll just take my things and go. He grabbed his suitcase out of the back seat, hoisted the other passenger's bloodied corpse over his shoulder, and started off into the desert. I stared at him for what must have been half an hour. Then I came to my senses and shot out of there like a NASCAR driver. I stopped at the nearest police station I could find and told a tastefully edited version of my story. I told them that, against my better judgment, I picked up a hitchhiker. He'd pulled a gun on me, and I'd pulled over. I told them that he'd shot himself, explained the bloodstains in the dash, and run off into the desert. They found his body out there 3 days later, after the desert animals had given him a makeover. They thought it confirmed my story, and I was free to go. I worked that job for 4 more years. A few things changed after that night. I couldn't stomach ginger ale anymore, and switched to root beer. I no longer found Green Day as entertaining and gave U2 a try. And for obvious reasons, I don't pick up hitchhikers anymore.
My twin sister Janessa was murdered at the age of 16. I witnessed it like a coward from atop a tree in the forest where it happened. I actually blacked out the memory for a while. I knew she was dead, but I couldn't remember how it happened. It wasn't until I tried therapy that it slowly came back to me. I was also reminded how much my parents used to fight. Our family was planning a camping trip the day before my sister's death. Before leaving, my parents erupted into a massive fight. Janessa and I were looking forward to the trip, and once again our parents' awful communication skills ruined everything before it even happened. We snuck out the house and took a lift to the forest. We left our phones at home, not caring whether our parents would be worried sick. We enjoyed ourselves the first day. I set up our tent, made a fire, had s'mores, and did all the stuff typically associated with camping. The next morning everything changed. I woke up alone in our tent. Outside I hear my sister talking to someone. Inquisitive, I opened the tent and saw someone sitting at our now out campfire who looked just like me. The figure transformed as soon as Janessa realized it wasn't me. Together we ran off. The thing was rushing after us with heavy footsteps. I was faster than my sister and a bit more athletic. I grabbed onto a tree branch and climbed up the tree. Janessa was not so lucky. I watched it happen. I watched that thing tear my sister to pieces. I'm still haunted by her screams. I also understand now why she always appears badly mutilated in my nightmares. I stayed up in that tree overnight, my sister's corpse laying in the leaves. Her remaining eye was staring up at me. While in therapy, there was a moment when I suddenly recalled the hallucination I had the morning of my sister's death. I thought I saw her corpse clawing at the tree where I hid. She wanted me to come down and join her. It caused me to panic and cry out. A couple of men who had been camping in my area heard my screams, and at last I was rescued. My parents don't argue anymore. I hardly see them at all anymore since my sister's death. Over the last couple years, my parents have frequently gone on vacations. They don't tell me where, and I never ask. I usually wake up and find out that they left yet again. I'm out of high school now and have no career path. I've only really had one thing on my mind since I remembered what killed Janessa. Now I'm returning to that forest where she died, and I'm going after that thing that killed her. I've been preparing for this, and if it's a Wendigo, like I've suspected, then I'm more than ready to take my revenge. This is how I'm doing it. I took a lift again. Had the driver known what I was carrying in my bags, I doubt he would have let me in. As I sat there, the realization of what I was doing grew heavy on me. What the hell am I doing? I've been talking myself up to do this for the last couple years. As much as I wanted a glorious victory, the closer I've come to this day, the more I've started to daydream about dying the same way that Janessa did. As angry as I am with my parents, I don't think they deserve to lose their only remaining child. But I just can't move on knowing that the thing's still out there. My legs were as dense as gold once I tried to exit the cab. The driver watched me awkwardly as I struggled to pull myself out, while putting my backpack on and working to carry the other supplies. Why was I doing this alone? I guess I didn't want anyone else to get hurt in this, but God, I wish I wasn't out here doing this alone. With each step I took into the forest, the more the terror numbed. I was in the domain of the Wendigo now. I wasn't entirely sure how much of the information about them was real. I knew that they could change their appearance. I know that their true form is just like the drawings people have made. There's no way to be an expert on these things unless you actually dealt with one. I'm still not sure why it decided not to come after me. Based on its size, I doubt it would have had any difficulty. Instead, I'm still alive and crazy enough to come back to pick a fight. As I set up camp, I found myself jumping at the sound of any bird call or movement by any nearby animal. The way I hammered in my tent, I knew I was calling attention to myself. In my left pocket was a gun. Like werewolves, I heard that silver bullets were necessary to kill wendigos, but what if I was wrong? The thought had been with me ever since I stepped foot back into these woods. I stopped frequently while setting up. Behind a nearby tree, I was almost certain I could see someone watching me, then hiding behind it. I didn't bother to walk over or check it out. I finished up the tent and made up my sleeping bag inside. As I did this, I heard calls that sounded almost human off in the distance. It probably knew I was here. The minutes went by slowly, but soon dusk set upon the forest. I built a fire like the one Janessa and I had made. I roasted 2 marshmallows. Despite her absence, I made a s'more for her as well, resting it on the sizable rock near the fire. As I ate it, I thought about our last night together. All things considered, it was pleasant. Being twins, we had our moments where we had gotten into arguments like our parents. We'd fought one another. We had our problems. But that night had been pleasant. I'd actually been glad that we decided to camp without our parents. As frightened as I still was, I felt the warmth, not from the fire. A sense of calm came over me, as my memories were suddenly flooded with the good times Janessa and I had. The good times were not for long. I could hear footsteps not far behind me. Jeremy. I could never forget that voice. It sounded like Janessa, but I knew it wasn't her. For some reason, I felt compelled to sit there calmly. As it approached, I could tell it was going to take a seat at the rock where I left the s'more. I glanced delicately to my right. I watched as a figure that looked almost identical to the Janessa I remember pick up the s'more and take a bite. That's not yours, I surprised myself by blurting out. The fake Janessa ignored me, continuing to scarf it down. My terror turned to anger. The thing responsible for my sister's death is sitting right next to me, mocking my grief. I didn't wait for it to finish. I pulled up my gun and pointed it directly at the figure. Before I could fire, the creature jumped to the left and turned around. I was stuck with paralysis when I saw the mutilated face of my sister's corpse staring back at me. I'm trapped, Jeremy. I struggled to keep aim. How dare this thing pretend to be her? It won't let me go, and it won't let you go either. We can be together again. It's much nicer than going home to an empty house and unliving parents. She held her hand out to me. Trust me, brother. Please. My trigger finger felt as though struck with a serious case of arthritis. Janessa took a step towards me. Wait, no. It's not Janessa. Why did I suddenly forget that? Feed the forest with me, Jeremy. It's so much better than being dead. Prove it. At last I pulled the trigger. The creature hollered in pain as it fell to the ground. I hit a lung, which wouldn't be enough. I aimed the gun at the heart, but failed to pull the trigger again as it rolled over and jumped back to its feet. Within seconds, it transformed from a corpse of my sister to its massive dark skeletal form with massive antlers. My mind was caught between fight and flight. I stood there aiming my gun, but desperately wanting to flee. As it rushed towards me, I chose the latter option. I rushed over to the bag I had left near my tent. Inside was a weapon that I built myself. As I rushed over, I could tell I wasn't going to outrun it. I fired another shot. The bullet lodged itself into the neck of the beast. It cried out once more, buying me a bit of time to get to the bag. Why didn't I have it unzipped? As I tried to open it, the Wendigo rushed towards me again. Just like the day of Janessa's death, I ran from the campsite, further into the forest, history repeating itself. I wasn't going to fail to avenge my sister. My parents weren't going to lose their last remaining child, all because I couldn't let it go. After at least several minutes, I somehow managed to keep outrunning it. I refused to slow down and look behind my shoulder. As I kept running, I noticed that I had gone in some sort of circle. Up ahead of me was the campsite. I had a chance to grab the bag and pull out the weapon. The closer I came to the campsite, the louder the Wendigo's footsteps became, and I could almost feel the wind as the creature tried to claw me. Once I reached the campsite, I put out my hand, clutching the bag. It felt like almost too great a risk to put the gun back in my pocket, but I needed it free to pull out the weapon. I managed to do this just with my left hand, pulling out the long metal spike. I built it in such a way that the spike would shoot out at a push of a button. The Wendigo wasn't going to slow down until it had me. I had no choice. I had to turn around. I would have to have perfect timing. I had to collect my debt from the creature that took my twin sister. Chew on this, you son of a bitch. I turned around, pressing the button that shot the spike out. Less than a foot from my face was the Wendigo. Its cry so loud it hurt my ears, and they began to ring. I had done it. The spike pierced the heart. Weakly, the Wendigo tried to swipe at me, but somehow lacked the strength. The next part was a gamble. I pulled out my gun and shot it in the head. It wasn't going to be enough to end a Wendigo, assuming what I read was correct. I rushed over to where I dropped the bag. Inside was the silver axe I had also designed myself. When I returned, the creature was still conscious, letting out agonizing cries. I felt no sympathy. I hacked off its wrist first. Its claws were the biggest threat, and I wanted them gone. Despite the weightlifting I've been doing, it took over a dozen hacks to remove the first long-fingered hand. I pulled out my gun and shot it in the head again. It subdued the creature long enough for me to remove the second hand, and then I began on its head. As I began walking up, I again found myself screaming at the creature. I demanded it stay dead, calling it every insulting name that came to mind. Once I had hacked most of my way through its head, I pulled it off. I kicked it a couple feet away. The Wendigo no longer moved. It took about an hour, but I managed to put each limb, the head, and the torso in trash bags that I had brought along. One by one, I carried them back to the campsite. I lit another fire, burning each bag. It took until dawn for me to burn the entire body. I left the torso for last. It was a struggle, but I managed to remove the heart, ripped it to pieces, and placed it in a silver box. After locking it, I looked around the site and decided to leave everything except my gun and box behind. I was never particularly religious, but in the months leading up to my fight, I'd gotten to know a priest in the church in my area. Luckily for me, he was there when I arrived with the silver box. His face was several shades paler when I showed it to him. Nevertheless, he escorted me to the back of the church with a pair of shovels and helped me bury it. Once done, I sat there, suddenly flooded with overwhelming emotions. I'd done it. My sister's killer was dead. Its body was burned, its heart in pieces and buried. Janessa, I cried out. I kept my promise. I killed it. The Wendigo can't hurt anyone else. It won't kill anyone else. I placed my lowered head into my hands and continued to cry. I'm sorry I wasn't braver before. I placed some flowers at my sister's grave an hour later. I talked to her tombstone as though she was listening. I like to believe that she was, and that she was pleased with my accomplishment. Afterwards, I returned home and slept through the day and the night. Once the morning came, I heard some noises downstairs. I went down to see my parents were home, sitting down for breakfast. They stopped and looked over at me, saying nothing. I walked over and pulled up a seat. I had no appetite at all. How was your trip? Where did you guys go? My parents exchanged looks before my father replied, We went to go visit your aunt and uncle. Did you enjoy it? I had difficulty keeping my chin from quivering as I lowered my head again. Jeremy, sweetie, what's wrong? Both my mother and father got up and came over to me. Why do you keep leaving me alone? God damn it, I'm your only kid left. Do you not give a shit about me? They hugged me tightly, offering apologies. I could have sworn I felt another pair of hands on my shoulders. The light touch was the most comforting of all. I really hope Janessa is proud of me, but a new task was ahead of me now. A harder task perhaps. I was going to have to figure out how to reconcile with my parents. Our family had been broken long before her death, but I know with some effort, things could be better than this. I hope she continues to give me the strength to put myself together as I progress into adulthood.
I've never really told anyone about this, and I really don't know how to properly explain what I saw, so this is my first and best attempt. My name's Zach, and I moved to a northwestern city in Washington State in early 2019, and I really don't know much about the area. I had recently gotten out of a pretty bad relationship, which actually led to me moving to this new city. Best decision of my life, by the way. I lived with my mom and her roommate for a while until I got my own place. And everything was going pretty well. I had a nice job, made some good money, and I had little to no rent. Plus, I was making a lot of new friends. One night, about 2 weeks into the new move, my buddy, let's just call him Jay, invites me to go out to play some pool and have a few drinks. It wasn't too late, maybe 9:30 p.m. So, I happily accepted the challenge. I grabbed my smokes, grabbed my phone, which I had unfortunately forgotten to plug in when I got home from work, searched for my keys, and got in my car. 10 minutes later, after blasting Blink-182 and some Scream music, I pull up to the bar. My buddy is already outside smoking a cigarette and waiting for me, and I sat in my car for a minute, finishing my cigarette, before I went to say what's up. We played pool for a little while that night. I had some beers, won a few games, lost a few games, and smoked a few cigarettes before I felt like going home around 11:50 p.m. My buddy said he's gonna stay and hang out with some people he knew there, and so I left and got in my car and readied my phone for the Google Maps to find my way home, and it was dead. It had died while I was at the bar, and I didn't know these streets very well, but I didn't want to face the shame of walking back inside to tell my friend that I didn't know how to get home, so I decided to chance it. I mean, it wasn't even a 15-minute drive. It was pretty close by, right? Wrong. I got lost. About 10 minutes later, I realized I've taken a few too many wrong turns and ended up in this residential area with unfamiliar houses and streets. I kept driving on and on down these streets, trying to find a familiar landmark or a familiar street name so I could find my way home. But all I found was more and more of these strange residential houses. But then, this weird fog started rolling in. Now, fog isn't that uncommon in the Pacific Northwest, and I know that, but this fog felt off. It felt heavy. It was this light gray color, with a hint of tan or sand color, and it was swirling. It also stayed close to the ground and never really went above the tops of the houses. What really freaked me out was that I swear I kept seeing these small bipedal creatures running along the houses, through these people's yards, following my car. I could never get a close enough look at them to get perfect detail, but they were about 2 to 3 feet tall, gray, pasty, oily skin, and had what looked like white hair on their heads. These things were fast too, and there were about 6 or 7 of them. They were just running through this fog, and the further I went down these roads with them, the thicker the fog was becoming. No matter how slow or fast I was going, they just kept following me. Or was I following them? I could have been following them. I mean, they were always by my side and in front of me. I never saw them behind me. Were they leading me somewhere? They were so mesmerizing. I just wanted to keep following them, just to see where they were going, but I knew better than that. Something felt wrong. I had to get out of there. I got that weird, sixth sense feeling of I shouldn't be here right now, right before something bad happens. All of a sudden, this dark, gray, and white wolf came running out of the fog and right in front of my car. I quickly slammed on my brakes, nearly crashing into one of the parked cars along the street. This wolf just stood in the middle of the street, looking at me, and I swear we locked eyes for what felt like hours. But then, bam, the wolf bolts off down the street, and I instinctively follow. I slam the car into drive, peel out, and begin following this wolf down the side street after side street. This wolf stayed right in the middle of the street the entire time. It was crazy. I had never seen anything like this in my life. I didn't even think there were wolves in this area, this close to the city. It wasn't long before I noticed that the fog had gotten lighter and eventually disappeared. That was when I realized that I'm on a road that I recognized that actually leads me directly to my house. With a confused and amazed look on my face, I glanced back to where the wolf was at, just in time to see it dart off into the forest, never to be seen again. I got home safely that night, and to this day, I still have no idea what I experienced that night.
I don't believe in witches, but that they're real. They're real. This is a phrase I often heard said when I was a child growing up in the north of Chile, a long and narrow country in the southernmost area of the American continent. A magical land with unforgiving deserts at the north, dark and impenetrable forests in the south, and enormous icy blue glacials reaching the south end of the world. The north of Chile, where I grew up, is a desert area where the soil itself is filled with chemicals such as peroxide that kill anything trying to grow in it. But these same sterile soils are filled with riches and minerals, especially silver and copper. And because of this wealth in mineral resources, there has been a mining industry in the area since the late 19th century, even before big cities and the resources needed for them arrived in those areas. The north of Chile is filled with ancient legends and mysteries. People are often lost in the desert and never found, or return several years later, looking just as they did when they disappeared, still believing it is the very day when they went missing. Strange voices of centuries-old battles are still heard. Terrifying creatures roam the dunes, and, of course, beings not from this world are often seen by people working in the copper mining operations. But those are all stories for another time. Before these mysteries populated the minds of the local folklore and superstition, people already spoke of witches in their infernal Black Sabbath, where they would commune with darkness incarnate and surrender themselves to the most wicked of perversions the human mind can conceive. Child sexual abuse, torture, cannibalism, animal and human sacrifice, etc. In Chile, when someone speaks of witches, it is a neutral pronoun, for there are female as well as male witches, both equally abominable, both working to spread misery wherever they went, turning people away from the righteous path and towards a life of hedonism and self-destruction. Because that's ultimately what darkness seeks, to drag you through feces and destroy your very soul, while you smile and ask for more. It is said witches fly towards their Black Sabbath on Friday nights, during the new moon when the skies are dark, only lit by the soft glow of the distant stars on a branch of the Milky Way we can see, which when seen on moonless desert nights, looks as if the night itself was a living being, exposing its backbone to us. These witches don't fly on a broomstick as many people think European witches do. These witches don't fly on a broomstick as many people think European witches do. Oh no. These witches meet in caves deep in the mountains, in ravines and crevices where normal-sized people would have a hard time fitting in, where only children could maneuver their way around, or get lost forever. Instead of broomsticks, these witches turn themselves into strange birds. Some say these birds look like very large cows or like black vultures, while others claimed these strange creatures, which the Amerindians called tutu, are instead the very heads of the witches, which they detach from their bodies by means of dark craft, with a necromantic vest made of human skin, the skin of someone who loved them and whom they loved. A grotesque transformation was invoked, ears turning into large black wings and their veins and viscera hanging as it would on a decapitated head turn into birds' feet with sharp and strong talons, with which they can steal children whose parents were careless and look away if only for a moment. But not all babies that were stolen ended up eviscerated and devoured, with their skin becoming soft leather, or their fat being used for candles and chthonic rituals. The very lucky ones got to live a life of constant hell, becoming an Mbunchi, a twisted and deformed creature of pain and sorrow, with their hands and legs broken and then mended in unnatural contortions, in a way the human body was never meant to move. These monstrosities would become guards at the entrance of the witches' cavern system. It is said that sometimes, on moonless nights, you can hear the witches cry out as they fly by, a horrible scream of agony and joy. And when you hear them, you must say this to them. "Fly by, devil bird. You are already late. Jesus Christ came by earlier, and he has already won the race." I have personally never seen or heard of these devil birds, these witches. But my grandmother once told me the story of one of her family members, before she was born, who had a close encounter with these things, and the horror she endured haunted her for the rest of her life. This story is based on real events. My grandmother told me about her great-aunt, who once lived in the small town of Salamanca, a mining village of barely 12,000 people in present day and perhaps only 1,000 people in the late 19th century when these events took place. Salamanca was in a semi-deserted area, with 2 rivers nearby that allowed some vegetation to grow. Back then, most people were poor and didn't have many options to make a living. If you were a woman, you found yourself a good husband who hopefully didn't beat you too harshly. And if you were a man, you found yourself a mining job, risking your life every day in dark tunnels, only to earn barely enough to feed your family, and often dying before your time, buried alive when one of those tunnels collapsed, or from lung cirrhosis after decades of breathing toxic substances. My grandmother's great-aunt was one of the lucky women who found herself a good husband, a hard-working man who didn't drink and didn't beat her, and only wanted to save enough from his work to one day own some land of his own, land he could leave to his children. He had been working since he was 12 years old. This was the way it was back then, when kids as young as age 10 were forced to earn a living and help around the house, as feeding hungry bellies was more important than earning an education that could help better their lives. In spite of all the challenges, they were happy. They had met when they were both teenagers, at church. Soon they were married and they moved together to Salamanca so he could find work as a miner. They had hopes for the future, and within a short time of moving to their new home, she became pregnant with their first child. Pregnancy, and especially the time after childbirth, are the most dangerous moments for a woman and child when dealing with darkness and its minions. Witches crave the tender, soft flesh of a newborn baby, and they enjoy driving a fragile woman to madness and despair. But my grandmother's great-aunt held on to her faith, traditions, and superstitions. Even though she heard the bone-chilling cries of those devil birds on moonless nights, far off in the distance and getting closer, she knew what to say. And she always held on to her baby, knowing if she would let go of him for an instant, the witches would have him for supper. Years went by of happy and simple life, a hard-working couple with faith for the future, living one day at a time. Their baby grew up soon. Too old to be carried away by the witches now. He was now 9 years old. Her womb desired to be a mother again, so they conceived another baby, this time a baby girl. And once again their house was filled with jingles and nursery songs. And once again they had to worry about devil birds, witches, and their sharp iron teeth, their blood-curdling screams, and not knowing if one day they'd close their eyes just for a second too long, and their baby would be gone forever. Their first son had grown up too fast. He was a smart boy who did well in school, with an inventive and curious mind, just like every other kid of his age. It wouldn't be too much longer till he would have to abandon school and find work at a farm or in the copper mines. He wished it could be different, but that's just how things were back then. My grandmother's great-aunt wished it would be different too. She wanted him to study and become a doctor, or perhaps a priest, someone who did good for the world. With his newborn little sister at home, the boy felt like a big man already. He had no more time for thinking about childish games, even though he missed a time of careless existence, and now he missed his mother's hugs and kisses. She was looking away from him, looking to her newborn baby. He felt it, and he knew he was no longer her little baby anymore. One morning, before her husband went up to go to work, she woke up to make breakfast for her family. She noticed the door on the back of their little adobe house was left open, and her heart sank to her stomach. Had someone come into their house? She went to check again on her little baby girl. She was safe and sound in her crib. Next, she went to check on her young boy, and his bed was empty. Had he run away, or was he taken? It was a moonless night. Just a few moments later, the boy came through the door. Before dawn, before his father would wake up, he had walked up to the river that crossed the valley of Salamanca, the only thing that allowed any vegetation to grow in this semi-desert area of the world. He had gone to swim in the pitch-black darkness and think about his future. She scolded her boy for being so careless and for leaving the door open like that, knowing fully well what superstitions say. And for going alone into the night, because even if witches thought him a bit stale for their taste, there were still plenty of bad people who wouldn't think twice of hurting a young kid wandering the streets at night. But she was happy. Happy he hadn't run away as she suspected. After being scolded, the boy replied, "Mom, I don't want to be a miner. I don't want to work on a farm. I want a better life." Saying these words in a calm and gentle voice, barely above a whisper. His mom understood how he felt. She hugged and tried to comfort him. "What would you like to do instead?" she asked him, knowing their options were extremely limited. I don't know. I want to study, perhaps travel and see the world. I want a chance for a better life. I'm sure I can think of something better than just staying here." For a moment they held each other in silence. "Whatever you choose, I'll support you," she said, trying to show empathy, and knowing fully well what his only real options were, hoping he'd come to his senses. Days went by, and with them also the phases of the moon. She didn't have to worry about the devil birds for a little while, but she felt in her heart that her boy would truly run away soon, before he was even 10 years old. She told her husband her concerns, and together they decided it was time for him to talk some sense into the boy. Show him the value of hard work, because sooner or later, at 10 or 16 years old, he'd have to learn it. My great-granddad's husband took his son to the mines with him, to show him how being inside these tunnels and crevices wasn't so bad. "You're right. Life in these tunnels isn't too bad," the boy said, while coyly smiling, perhaps accepting his fate. Nearly a month went by, and things were normal. The family would be together for dinner, go to church together, living a life of normal and expected. But soon, the moonless nights would return. It was the first night of the new moon, and they all went to bed early, leaving their candles on until they'd fallen asleep, as if the soft golden glow of a single candle illuminating a cold room could hold back the vast darkness of the moonless night outside. Suddenly, appalling screams that sounded like the shrill cries of a baby or the desperate pleas of a dying man woke them up. The candles had gone out, and a misty, chill air floated through the house. The screams were getting closer and closer, and then, suddenly, thuds loudly fell on the roof, breaking the shingles with loud cracks. Multiple, petrifying, horrific screams came from the roof. She got out of bed, waking up her husband, both trembling with fear. The cradle with her little baby girl was next to them. The little girl woke up as well, crying loudly as those things outside. She tried to light her candle, but it wouldn't light up. He tried as well, but it was as if that misty chill floating around them kept any fire, any light from igniting. Suddenly, the screams were coming from inside the house, shrill and stupefying sounds only comparable to a nightmare. She picked up her baby, and her husband went in front of her. Grabbing a hammer he kept nearby, naively thinking this could serve as a defense in case those things got too close. They headed towards their son's bedroom, walking in the darkness, tripping over the little furniture they had, making their way towards their boy so they'd all be together. They made it into the boy's room. As he lay in bed awake, the family sat together on the bed in pitch-black darkness, recognizing each other only by instinct and each other's body warmth and shape. The birds kept screaming, now walking inside of the house, getting closer and closer towards them. In total darkness, the family realized they were under siege. The room soon was filled with these devil birds coming to take the little baby girl. The father got up and swung his hammer towards the sound of the devil birds, without thinking twice, only hoping wild action could give his family a fighting chance. And then she felt small hands taking away her baby. In just an instant, she couldn't even fight it. It was only a quick pull, and her treasured child was out of her arms. She couldn't see, only feel intense terror, imagining the future of her precious baby. From outside of the house, the parents heard a scream. This time not one of the devil birds, but one equally horrifying. It was their boy, screaming. He was being taken away. "Mother?" he screamed, as we all call for our mother when overwhelmed by fear. And suddenly, the house was empty, except for the two parents. The devil birds were simply no longer there. They had vanished like a shadow, as silent and swiftly as an evil thought. They heard distant screams once again, getting farther away every second. They were heading towards the mountains, towards the old tunnels and caves. They couldn't believe what just happened. They just knew they had to get their kids back, no matter the cost. The parents ran as fast as they could towards the mountains where the mines were, and where superstitions said the caves of the witches were as well. They arrived at the feet of the mountain, the entrance to the tunnels, and in the darkness they entered, holding each other's hand, hoping their love would protect them. They walked deeper and deeper into the tunnel, only following sounds of distant crying of children. Finally, they arrived in a chamber the hard-working miners didn't know existed in those tunnels. Torches lit up a circle around them, and a tall man wearing a black robe faced away from them. They saw the man had their young boy by the throat, but there were no signs of their baby girl. "Let him go, you motherfucker, or I swear to God I will fuck you up," said the husband, always a tough man. He took a step forward towards the man in the black robe, but no matter how much he walked forward, he didn't move at all. My great-grandaunt was paralyzed by fear, still standing on the threshold of the chamber, observing this terrible scene. The man in the black robe turned around to face them, his face obscured by the long hanging robe over his eyes, but they could see he was an old man, with long bony hands and very white skin. "Let's make a deal," said the man in the black robe. "I'll let your boy go in exchange for you," he said. The tough man, hard-working father and husband didn't think twice. He nodded and got closer to the man in the black robe, this time actually being able to move closer. "I'm here. Let go of my son now," said the father. "Come closer," said the man in the black robe. The father obeyed him, now face to face with the man in the black robe. The father tried to raise his hands and strangle the man in the black robe, but something prevented him from doing it. It's not that something held his hands back. Instead, it was as if his arms didn't respond to his commands at all. Then, the father felt a sharp pain on his chest. A ritual dagger was cutting him till its tip reached his backbone. The man in the black robe twisted the dagger, causing the father unbearable pain. At this moment of agony, the father noticed the low angle of the stab wound, and he closed his eyes and opened them again, having a revelation more horrendous than the certain death that awaited him. There was no old man in the black robe. The one who had stabbed him was his son. The boy held on to the dagger, his father's blood dripping down his arm. The mother, still paralyzed by the threshold of the chamber, screamed and screamed until her throat was raw. "Why? Why?" asked the father, as he felt life slipping away from him. "I want to fly," said the boy, opening his mouth and revealing sharp iron teeth, grinning widely in an unnatural way. So many teeth, so sharp and so big, they couldn't possibly fit in his mouth. The boy looked at his mother standing in the back, and he said, "Mommy, I figured out what I want to do with my life." His mother looked at him with terror in her eyes, as he smeared his father's blood on himself, finally washing away the baptism which he had first washed away in the river at night on a moonless night. The boy began to vomit, not food, but his own insides, his guts coming out of his mouth, the flesh around his neck detaching as torn flesh, his ears growing and turning into large black wings, his head turning into a monstrous bird, and his body falling to the floor, vanishing before touching the ground. The mother turned around and ran into the night, crying and unable to contain her anguished screams. Her son was no longer her boy, and her little baby was ripped from her arms. She found her way out of the tunnel and ran back to town, screaming for help. The next day, the people in town went looking for the missing baby girl, but after days of searching, they never found her. But they did find the skinned corpse of my great-granddad's husband. Many people believed her story, that witches had taken her children and killed her husband, while others thought she was crazy, and she must have killed her husband and drowned her children. She never told them what she had really seen and what had truly become of her son. Eventually, she left the town and moved to the capital city of Santiago de Chile. After years of solitude, still being an attractive woman, she remade her life and found a measure of happiness with a new husband, a kind and wealthy widower with children from his previous marriage. But still, my grandmother told me that her great-aunt dreamt about what had happened often for the rest of her life. And on moonless nights, when those wicked witches and devil birds could be heard screaming in the distance, she heard them and could clearly hear a word in their screams. Perhaps she imagined it, but among the cacophony of screams, she could clearly hear one of the voices that shouted, "Mother."
Norma Jean drew a heart on the back of my hand in hoop snake blood. "When that fades," she said, tapping the center of her work, "you may forget about me." Norma Jean and I dated on and off through high school and then some. We grew up wandering the forest and exploring the caverns surrounding Ripple Creek, running from the hide-behinds and hodags when we stumbled too far into their territory. The backwoods of Minnesota were our playground, from the shores of Loon Lake to the edge of Crazy Dan's property, where the pine trees grew so tall you couldn't see the sky. The day Norma Jean disappeared, I saw a tea kettler scuttling around the shed behind my place. It walked backwards, like they do, and bumped right into the pile of wood I spent all day chopping. Tea kettlers don't ever stray so far from the woods. They're very shy. I had planned to see about trapping it the next day, show Norma Jean. Of course, that didn't happen after all. I heard about Norma Jean the next morning, on my way to the general store for a new axe. The axe handler hounds got mine. Bunch of people everywhere, conversing in little groups, tittering like birds. They all stopped talking when they saw me, shuffled away when I drew near. I didn't say anything. Something in their gaze made my voice feel as though it had rusted away. Finn was the one who pulled me aside, said people hadn't seen hide nor hair of Norma Jean in 2 days. Birdie got worried after her cat sat out on the road so long and called the cops. They went up to the Janesies, and that's when they found the blood on the floor. Crazy Dan was already mumbling about hide-behinds to anyone who would listen. Not me. Norma Jean and I have been getting away from hide-behinds for years. Everyone's talking, but no one's actually saying anything. A lot of whispering about the Wendigo among the superstitious. More ordinary whispers from the less superstitious. One of the elders is a full-blooded Cree. I overheard a couple of old biddies asking for talismans. Lots of narrowed eyes my way. I don't know what to say. The cops already interviewed me. I dated Norma Jean, and so did Aaron, Spruce, Hunter, Alder, Flint. Norma Jean was a pretty gal. Milk white skin, sky blue eyes, corkscrew blonde hair. Any guy would be lucky to have her on his arm. No one in Ripple Creek has slept easy lately, not with this hanging over our heads. I've had to buy 2 more axes in the last 4 weeks. I keep leaving them outside. The axe handler hounds must love me. I hear them barking the nights I forget to put my axe away, excited to have a free meal. Norma Jean would have laughed at me if she were still here. The thought brings the metallic taste of sorrow to my tongue. I remembered it in a dream, when Norma Jean and I went to Loon Lake Cemetery. There's no road out there anymore. You have to hike through the woods and over swampland that's just as likely to suck you down as it is to let you pass. Norma Jean always had a thing for the supernatural. They say there are 3 witches buried in that graveyard. If you step over one of their graves, they will come for you. 2 of the headstones are near the grove. The 3rd is missing. You really think there's a witch buried here? The weathered tombstones are nearly unreadable in the weak beam of my flashlight. Maybe. Norma Jean rests on her haunches, tracing a finger over a name more than a century gone. Her blonde corkscrew hair is silver under the moon. She turns to me with a crooked smile. Are you afraid? The place did give me the shivers, even in my dream, but I wasn't afraid. No. She smiles a little wider. There are too many teeth in her mouth. Are you sure? I woke up with a pounding heart and a lump in my throat. My mouth tasted like blood, and I can't seem to scrub the feeling away. Mostly I try to just forget the whole thing. Forget I ever dated Norma Jean. It's alright most of the time. I chop and sell wood, and another winter passes. Then I see the hoop snake blood heart on the back of my hand, and it all rushes back. The blonde corkscrews, Norma Jean and me. The hide-behinds and hodags, Norma Jean and Flint, the late nights and long hikes, Norma Jean and Alder, the axe handler hounds, swallowing my axe whole. The storm had swelled seemingly from nowhere. It had not been forecast, nor had I seen any dark clouds on the horizon before they had consumed me. The sail of my dinghy had long since been torn away by the gale, and for hours I clung to the rudder and rowlocks in the hopes I would not be thrown into the churn. The storm was relentless. I could see not a crack in the clouds that might suggest its cessation. Before long, giving up any hope that I might be spared from nature's fury, I closed my eyes and prayed. With a crash, I was thrown from my boat onto a soaked, but certainly solid surface, although I knew not where. It seemed the storm had brought me to land. Weak and weary, I clawed at the sand, eager to not be taken once more by the tide, dragging my languid body inland and desperate for respite. Again I prayed, this time for sanctuary. As if by way of an answer, lightning illuminated the cliff face, revealing what appeared to be a cave or cavern. With no other objective or option, I crawled towards the opening and, sheltered from the rain and wind, allowed fatigue to calm me. A pulsating light from deeper in the cave roused me from my exhaustion. Rising to my aching feet, I crawled forward until I came across a narrow stone staircase carved into the rock leading deep into the bowels of the cliff. Mindful of the scattered rocks and debris left behind by the tide, I followed the steps. As I ventured down, the pulses of the light grew brighter, and the narrow passage broadened into a wide alcove. Tapestries laced with gemstones and glowing minerals lined the walls of the chamber, emblazoned with sigils and hieroglyphics that did not appear of man-made origin. Amongst the drapery, a particular motif stood out around a dark maw-like opening in the back wall, a writhing mass of luminous purple tendrils, its boundless limbs pervading their way into every other scene depicted throughout the room, accented with fine incandescent threads. The detail of each limb was such that they seemed to twist and contort as if living and conscious. The visage of this creature was quite unlike anything I had ever seen on this earth. Quite curious of what lay on the other side, yet fearful of the bizarre appearance of the mass, I cautiously approached the gape. The hole was larger than I had expected and opened out into a vast chasm. Despite the immensity of the glow offered by the illuminated tapestries, any light that attempted to pass through was soon consumed by the shadows of the rift. Although I could see nothing of what lay beyond, I was certain I could hear the echo of a river running below. It was at that moment that I heard the trickling of liquid running down the stairway, through which I had entered the chamber. Merely drips at first. The sound soon became that of a gentle but steady stream. I assumed that the tide had come in and the waves would soon pour into the cave, but what ran into the chamber did not look like water. The liquid was black as pitch and thick like oil. What struck me in particular was this unusual solution, was the way it moved. It did not seem to flow as water with gravity and around obstacles, but rather it seemed quite capable of deciding its own path, flowing up and along the walls, climbing rocks and debris in ways that natural fluids would find quite impossible. Enthralled as I was with such a peculiar sight, I had barely thought to move out of the way of the inky stream as it ran over my boots, up the wall and down the gaping throat of the glowing creature into the chasm beyond. I reached for my journal, hoping to make some notes or perhaps a sketch of this strange occurrence, but it was waterlogged beyond any possible use. As I continued to gaze in awe, the ichor flowing about me quickened, and I felt the grasp of unseen tendrils tighten around my ankles. Without warning, I found myself being dragged towards the maw, the shadowy blackness beyond eager to swallow me up. The abysmal chasm echoed with my panicked screams as I was thrown from the precipice into the raging stream below. I gasped for breath, but the air in the chasm was thick and acrid, the nauseating stench of the mysterious river burning my lungs. As I struggled to remain afloat, ringlets of ooze rose from the nauseous blackness, clasping at my neck and face, congealing around my throat. I tried to scream again, but the inky tendrils choked my attempts to cry out. My enemy was inescapable. The more I resisted, the firmer I felt its grasp become. Fighting a hopeless battle, I was dragged under, downwards into the Cimmerian depths. I awoke to the sensation of warm sunshine on my face and the familiar sound of waves lapping at the coast. My nostrils and throat burned from the memory of the foul fluid and its fumes, but I had not a scratch upon me. Scanning the horizon, I could see nothing that I knew about the remains of my sailboat that littered the shoreline. In the sand lay a single set of tracks leading to a familiar crack in the cliffs. I'm not going to write a long, drawn-out document. I'm just going to leave something that proves that something happened. I've been sitting in my RV mentally getting myself ready. In one hand is this pen, and in the other, a bottle of whiskey. It's just everything that has happened ever since we got here is too crazy to make up. A damn thing. It's not a thing. It's a damn monster. If that monster hadn't shown up, then my family would still be here. Why did things go so wrong? It was supposed to be a simple family trip out to the woods. My wife and I saved like crazy to get this RV and took our 3 children off. I wanted to take my children away from the overbearing life of technology and show them the joys of nature. I was an avid hunter in my youth, but as you know, when you start to have a family, life starts to take you in a different approach. However, now that my kids are getting older, I thought it was time to get back in and show them what their dad loved doing. This was supposed to just be a normal family trip. Why did that monster appear? Why did it take my kids? My wife? Why did I do nothing as I stood there as it ripped my wife into pieces? I watched as my children screamed out in fear as they were drowning in their own blood. And I did nothing. Or were my hunter and survival instincts in that moment? I know where they were. They were me trying to survive. Why did I become such a coward? I hate myself for not even trying to save them. Sorry, I didn't mean to rant like that. Like I said, I didn't want this to be drawn out, but whoever finds this, be careful, for all those stories about monsters in the woods are real. I used to laugh when I heard my brother talk about them non-stop. I chalked them up to stories used to scare kids, but now I know. I should have packed up my family when I first heard the gruesome howl that came from behind the tree line. I should have left when my daughter found that giant footprint, a footprint that no animal or human could have made. I should have left when I started to smell that gut-wrenching odor. Yeah, just think about all those should-haves, and if only now. Great that my mind tries to be smart now of all times. Well, my whiskey's almost gone. That means it's time for me to head on out. I won't be alone. No. I have my trusty hunting rifle with me. I think 4 bullets should be enough. Yeah, 4 will be enough. 4 for them. That way the monster will feel like it's the 4 of them tearing into it. I'll get him with everything I got. I'll avenge your deaths, or die trying.